Welcome to the Sleep Time History channel. Here we create immersive first-person stories from the pages of history, told gently through the eyes of those who lived them. Each episode invites you to step into moments of the past. Walk quietly beside emperors, explorers, revolutionaries, and forgotten heroes, not as distant names, but as real people experiencing history firsthand. Our aim is simple: to help you relax, transport you somewhere peaceful, and guide you gently into sleep. If you've enjoyed this experience, please consider liking and subscribing. It genuinely helps our channel grow, enabling us to create more soothing content for you. And if you'd like to leave a comment, we'd love to hear which historical figures or moments you'd like us to cover next. Your ideas inspire future episodes. Thank you for joining us. Now, relax and let history carry you softly towards sleep.
In this episode, we journey back to London during the Blitz, a time when the skies rumbled and the night stretched long, with fear and quiet resilience. Told from the perspective of an ordinary Londoner, this is a gentle reflection on life lived beneath the threat of falling bombs. Each sound, each silence, each flicker of light in the blackout is explored with calm and care, offering a soothing path through memory and history. Now, breathe deeply, and let the echoes of the past guide you gently into sleep. It's the quiet that gets you. Not the bombs, not the fire, not the chaos. No, it's the quiet before, the lull that settles over the street like a breath held too long. That strange stillness in the air, like the whole city is waiting for something it dreads but can't avoid. I live on the third floor of a terraced house in Bethnal Green. Mum and Dad passed away before the war, and my younger sister evacuated to Dorset with the school children 2 years ago. I stayed. There were reasons, or excuses maybe. I had a job at the post office, a fiancé in the Home Guard, friends who promised we'd see it through together. But mostly it was stubbornness, a belief that London was home, and you don't abandon home when it's in trouble. The flat is narrow and old. There's a patch of wallpaper peeling above the fireplace, and the windows rattle in the frame when a lorry goes by too fast. But it's mine. I've made it warm. I've made it safe. At least I try to believe that. You see, the danger isn't just in the bombs. It's in the waiting. The constant, maybe. The sky might be clear today, but that means nothing. Yesterday was clear too, until the sirens started up around 7. The hum of engines above the clouds. The sudden panic. Running for the shelters. Knowing you have 5 minutes, maybe less, before the earth starts to shake. But today, no sirens, no shadows overhead. Just the sound of footsteps on the pavement below, the faint chime of a milkman's cart rolling past. I'm on edge anyway. We all are. At the post office, people speak in lowered voices. Not because of secrecy, but because noise feels wrong somehow, like it might bring the danger closer. Mr. Davison, who mans the front desk, keeps a tin helmet under his counter and glances out the window every few minutes. He tries to hide it, but we all notice. Customers come in like ghosts. Some ask for stamps or to post letters to husbands in North Africa or the Channel. Others just need someone to speak to be reminded that life is still ticking forward, that someone else sees them. Loneliness is another war altogether. Around lunchtime, a woman with wide eyes and shaking hands walks in holding a telegram. Her son, gone in the Blitz over Coventry. She doesn't say much, just stares down at the paper as if by reading it enough times she might rewrite it. We offer her tea, but she declines. By the time I head home, dusk is bleeding into the rooftops. The streets are a little emptier than they used to be, though some children still play in the doorways, and couples walk hand in hand with their coats drawn tight. People keep on. That's the miracle of it, really. People keep on. I pass the bakery, boarded up since the last raid. A sign still hangs, cracked and faded. fresh bread daily. Some of us still remember when that was true. Now we trade ration coupons like currency, and the idea of something as simple as a warm loaf feels almost decadent. At home, I cook something small, tinned stew and a crust of bread. I light a candle to save the electricity, drawing the blackout curtains closed before it gets fully dark. Somewhere a few streets over, I hear piano music, muffled and sweet. It makes me ache. I used to play, badly, on my uncle's upright when we visited as children. Those afternoons feel like someone else's life now. As I lie in bed, wrapped in a coat for warmth, I listen. I always do. For the whine of engines, the low, distant hum that means a raid might be coming. For the sirens, they haunt our dreams now. Some nights I swear I hear them even when I'm awake, and I rise from bed only to find the silence is real. Or worse, that it's the kind of silence that means they're coming, and we just haven't been warned yet. Fear makes you foolish. There's a packed bag near the door, a change of clothes, some tinned food, a small photograph of my sister and me at Southend-on-Sea. Smiling, sand between our toes. I don't remember the moment the photo was taken, but I look at it most nights. Proof, I suppose, that joy was real once, and might be again. We've made a little community in our street. Mr. Lyle downstairs has a wireless, and sometimes he invites a few of us over for the 9 o'clock news, though we have to keep the volume low. Mrs. Ahmed from next door grows herbs on her windowsill and always shares a bit if you knock and ask nicely. I don't know all their names. Not really. But we've nodded through enough close calls now to feel like something stronger than strangers. That's what the Blitz does to you. It strips everything back. What matters isn't how much money you have, or what you do for work, or who you know. It's whether you'll share your water, offer a blanket, pull someone out of rubble without stopping to ask questions. Tomorrow, maybe the bombs will come, maybe they won't. But tonight, it's quiet. And that, somehow, is the most terrifying thing of all. The sirens started just after midnight. Not the soft, uncertain whine we sometimes hear in error, but the real thing. Long and low, rising with dreadful certainty until the very walls seemed to hum with it. I was already awake, of course. Sleep doesn't come easily anymore. It hovers at the edge of things, taunting you with the idea of rest and then fleeing the moment your thoughts turn too dark. When the sirens come, you move. There's no time to think. I keep my coat at the end of the bed, boots by the door, and the bag is always ready. Everyone in the building knows the drill by now. We meet out front, then down the street to the public shelter near the old library. It was cold. Breath clouds cold. A wind blew in from the east, the sort that cuts through fabric and skin like it's aiming for the bones. Mrs. Linton from the second floor was crying again, but quietly this time, a sort of resigned sobbing. She clutched her handbag like it was a child. The shelter isn't glamorous, nothing about this life is, but it's solid. Concrete and earth and steel, lined with benches and the occasional folding cot. The smell hits you first. Damp wool, burnt paraffin, too many people packed in too tight. But it's safe. Or at least, it's safer than being above ground. Children sleep in laps, their faces pressed against coats and cardigans, unaware for now of the danger. An old man reads aloud from a tattered novel by the glow of a lantern, his voice soft and measured like a lullaby. The rest of us wait. We listen. The first explosion comes somewhere across the river. You feel it before you hear it. A kind of pressure in the chest, like the air has been punched. Then the sound follows, a deep, percussive thud that makes a few people flinch involuntarily. Then another, and another. Some of us pray, some try not to cry. I just sit with my hands wrapped around a mug of weak tea and stare at nothing. It's strange what you think about in moments like that. Not death exactly, not directly, but the things you'd miss. The way the sunlight looks through clean glass, the smell of newspapers in the morning, my sister's laugh. I don't even remember the joke, just the sound it made. After about an hour, the bombs grow closer. You can tell by the sharpness of the sound, the way the shelter vibrates more with each impact. Dust sifts down from the ceiling. A child wakes and starts to cry, setting off another wave of tears in the dark. Someone says it's Stepney this time. Another insists it's nearer. Whitechapel, maybe. Rumours travel fast underground. Nobody really knows. The maps and reports will come tomorrow, showing the outlines of buildings that are no longer there. But right now, all we have is instinct and fear. Around 2, there's a blast so strong the benches shudder beneath us. The lights flicker. Someone screams. A few people start to rise, panic bubbling up like steam. But a warden barks at them to sit back down. We can't go anywhere, not yet. Eventually, the noise subsides. The all clear doesn't come for another hour, but the bombs seem to stop. One by one, people begin to doze again, their bodies giving in to exhaustion. I stay awake, my hand wrapped around the handle of my bag, just in case. When the siren finally sounds, the all clear, long and low but not rising, it's like the exhale of a city that's held its breath all night. We file out slowly, blinking against the grey dawn, half dead from worry and cold and lack of sleep. The streets are coated in dust, bricks scattered like children's toys. The air smells of smoke and ash and something chemical I can't quite name. I see the library's windows are gone. The corner shop's been hit. The roof is caved in and the front window blown out. A loaf of bread lies half covered in rubble. Mr. Lyle says we were lucky this time, that it could have been worse. That's what people always say. I make my way back home. The flat is intact, though the windows are cracked a little more and there's a new fissure in the plaster near the ceiling. I sweep up some glass, boil water for tea, and sit for a while staring at the wall. My hands won't stop shaking. At work things are slow. No one wants to be out unless they must. Still, a few people come in. A woman asks if we've heard anything about the damage near Aldgate. I say no, gently. She nods, then mails a letter anyway. Mr. Davison gives me a nod of respect I haven't seen before. Shared survival does that. The unspoken knowing. We made it. For now. That afternoon, I walked to the end of the road where a building once stood. It's gone now, flattened. I don't even remember what it was. A bakery? A tailor? Something with a red awning. I feel guilty for not knowing. For not noticing before it disappeared. We all do that now. Take mental inventory of our surroundings. Not just to remember, but in case tomorrow they vanish. Back home, I sit on the edge of my bed and peel off my boots. My feet ache, my back is sore. My eyes feel gritty, and I think I might sleep for a week if only the night would let me. But it won't. Outside, a boy kicks a can down the street. His mother calls to him. A neighbour lights a cigarette and leans out her window. Normal things, human things, defiant in their way. That night before bed, I take out the photograph again. My sister, in her coat, smiling like the world could never hurt her. I whisper a promise I've made a dozen times before, that I'll see her again, that I'll live, even if tomorrow the sirens come again. There are days when nothing happens, and yet everything does. The kind of day that stretches endlessly, soaked in tension, where each sound, each creak of the floorboards, each shout in the distance, feels like it might be the beginning of something terrible. These are the days I find hardest. No sirens today, no planes. Just a heavy grey sky that presses down on the rooftops like a hand. I went to work as usual. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet you feel rather than hear. People walked faster, their heads down, coats drawn tight. Even the birds seemed muted. At the post office, we pretended to carry on. There were parcels to sort, letters to stack, forms to file. But our movements were automatic. Everyone's eyes flicked to the window at the slightest sound. Mr. Davison kept tuning the wireless in the back room, searching for any update, any hint that today might stay uneventful. Around mid-morning, a boy came in with a package for his father, who was stationed near Portsmouth. He couldn't have been more than 9, hair combed neatly, shoes polished as best he could manage. His mother stood behind him, silent. Her face was tired in a way makeup can't fix. I helped them weigh the parcel and affixed the postage. He asked if it would arrive before his father's birthday. I said I thought it would. I lied, of course. I had no idea. The mother whispered a thank you, and they left. I stood there a moment longer than necessary, watching the door swing shut behind them. That kind of visit lingers with you. By the time lunch arrived, I developed a headache from the strain of pretending everything was fine. I ate a cold sandwich in the sorting room and listened to the clock tick. Every tick felt louder than the last. After work, I walked home the long way. I needed the air, even if it was bitter. Bomb damage lined my route. Blackened bricks, roofless shells of homes, twisted lampposts. There's a house on Gloucester Street that's been reduced to rubble, but someone's placed a little Union Jack in the debris. It flutters, even in the faintest breeze. I don't know who put it there, but I hope they're all right. I passed a pub that had lost its windows in a raid last week. The owner had nailed boards over the gaps and scrawled, still pouring, in white paint. A few regulars stood outside, mugs in hand, sharing jokes that didn't quite reach their eyes. I nodded at them and kept walking. At home, the flat felt colder than usual. I lit a candle and checked the water heater. Still working, for now. I boiled enough for tea and sat by the window, though I kept the blackout curtains mostly drawn. From there, I could just see the top of the church spire and the edge of the rooftops across the street. That's when I noticed it. A woman, alone, standing at the corner, not moving. She was dressed plainly, hair tucked under a scarf, one hand clutching a small parcel. She didn't knock on any doors or look around. She just stood. After 10 minutes, she walked away. I don't know why it unsettled me. Something about the stillness of her. The way she seemed separate from everything around her, like a ghost watching from the edges. Later, I tried to read, but the words refused to settle in my mind. The silence grew heavier. I thought about going downstairs to see Mr. Lyle and listen to the wireless, but I didn't want to break the quiet. Even unpleasant peace is still peace. When I turned off the lamp and got into bed, I left my coat nearby, just in case. I always do. I tried to sleep, but my thoughts kept looping. The boy and his parcel, the woman on the corner, the ghost of a raid that hadn't come. There's a kind of madness that comes with waiting. It seeps into your routines, your gestures, your very breath. You start to imagine noises that aren't there. A faint hum, a distant boom, footsteps on the stairs. Your body prepares for something your mind can't define. And yet, we go on. We wash the dishes, we write letters, we sweep the floor. Not because it makes sense, but because it's what we have. It's the thread that ties us to who we were before the sky became an enemy. Just before sleep finally took me, I heard someone whistle in the street. A low, cheerful tune, familiar but out of place. I crept to the window, careful not to disturb the curtain too much. A man in uniform walked by, swinging a bag over his shoulder. He looked tired, but his steps were light. He turned the corner and the tune faded. But it lingered in my ears, a fragile melody floating in the fog of my thoughts. Some days, the silence is the hardest part. But even silence carries echoes of courage, of grief, of small kindnesses. And that, I suppose, is how we survive. It was early morning when I heard the knock. A quiet tapping, barely enough to wake me, but in these times sleep is light. I rose, wrapped my dressing gown tight, and opened the door to find Mrs. Ahmed from next door. Her eyes were wide. "They've hit the market," she whispered. "Whitechapel Road." I stared at her, words catching in my throat. The market? I knew people there. We all did. By the time I reached the street, a small crowd had gathered. Smoke still drifted over the rooftops, and the air carried that now familiar mix of soot, brick dust, and something metallic. The bomb had landed just before dawn. No warning, no sirens. A sudden roar in the sky, then chaos. I followed the others toward the site. It was worse than I'd imagined. Where the market stalls had stood, bright canopies and cheerful voices just yesterday, there was now a crater, still steaming, edged with splintered wood and scorched metal. The bakery, the one that sold those thick rye loaves, was a skeleton. A charred wall, half a sign. Someone said the grocer had been inside when it hit. Another said he'd left just in time. No one knew for sure. We picked through the wreckage, not to steal, but to remember. A spool of ribbon, still tied, a child's tin toy, a shattered teacup, edges sharp like teeth. The wardens arrived shortly after, shouting for everyone to clear the area. There might be more bombs, delayed fuses. One of them spotted me lingering and gave a look that said everything. Move on. There's nothing more you can do here. Back home, I couldn't settle. I scrubbed the floor though it wasn't dirty, dusted shelves that hadn't been touched in weeks. My hands moved, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept seeing the toy, a little red bus now half crushed, and wondering whose it had been. At noon, I went to check on Mr. Lyle. He was sitting by the wireless, tuning in and out of static. His voice cracked when he said he'd lost a cousin near the market. He hadn't seen him in years, but still. Blood was blood. I made us tea, and we sat without speaking for nearly an hour. Sometimes silence is the only kindness you can offer. In the afternoon, the post office opened late. We were short-staffed. Word had come that 2 of the girls were helping at a first aid post, but we managed. The queue stretched out the door. People needed to send word, to ask questions, to feel, perhaps, that something still worked. I handed out telegram forms, sorted letters, offered quiet reassurances I wasn't sure I believed. A man came in holding a photograph, shaking slightly. He was looking for his wife. She'd gone shopping that morning. No one had seen her since. I didn't know what to say. I asked for her name and promised to inquire, but we both knew what silence meant. That evening, the sky turned an odd shade of gold, clouds like bruises. I watched from the window as the light filtered over the rooftops, painting broken chimneys in soft hues. It was beautiful, in a cruel sort of way. I made soup from a powdered mix and added the last of my carrots. As it simmered, I listened to the radio, a woman's voice reading letters from soldiers, some hopeful, some resigned. One man wrote of the stars he saw from the desert, and how he tried to imagine the same stars over home. I found myself staring upward, though the blackout curtains were drawn. As night crept in, I checked the latch on the window, adjusted the curtains, and folded my coat at the end of the bed. Routine is armor. We build it like a wall against the fear. I lit a candle and pulled out my notebook. I don't write every day. Some days the words don't come. But tonight I needed to. I wrote about the boy's toy, about Mr. Lyle's cousin, about the man with the photograph. I don't know who will read these pages. Maybe no one. maybe my sister, years from now. But writing helps. It anchors me. Just before bed, I stepped into the hallway and stood there for a moment, listening. No sirens, no hum of engines, just the tick of a clock and the faint creak of pipes cooling in the walls. Peace, of a kind. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that we had lost not just people, but some small piece of ourselves. The market had been more than food and stalls. It had been a meeting place, a thread in the tapestry of our days. And now it was gone. Grief doesn't always arrive in floods. Sometimes it seeps in, quiet and slow, until you're drenched before you even notice. Still, tomorrow will come. I'll rise, I'll go to work, I'll smile at strangers and hand out stamps. Not because I'm strong, but because that's what we do. We carry the weight together, even when we feel like collapsing. Somewhere in Dorset, my sister is asleep, safe and warm. I cling to that thought as I close my eyes. One bright, unbroken thread in the darkness. Today, the sirens came in the afternoon. I was restocking envelopes when the sound started. Slow and mournful at first, rising like a scream across the rooftops. Every muscle in my body tensed. It didn't matter how many times I'd heard it before. The sound always felt like a warning sent straight to the heart. We moved quickly. Mr. Davison barked orders, and I grabbed my bag from under the counter. We locked the doors and joined the stream of people heading for the shelter at the far end of the street. It was orderly mostly. People know the drill. But fear buzzed beneath every step. This time, the raid was close. As we descended the steps, the rumble of engines overhead was unmistakable. Low, menacing, as if the sky itself had grown angry. The shelter filled fast. Strangers pressed together shoulder to shoulder. There were children, babies even, some wrapped in blankets, some in nothing but vests and knitted hats. The first explosion came just as I sat down. A deep, concussive boom that rattled the benches and made dust rain from the ceiling. Someone screamed. Another blast followed, then another. Closer. The lights flickered, and for a terrible second I thought we'd be plunged into darkness. I clutched my knees and breathed slowly. In, out, in, out. My eyes stayed on a crack in the floor, watching it for any sign of movement. That was all I could do. There's something awful about waiting underground, not knowing where the bombs are falling. You imagine everything. Your own building, your neighbour's house, the church, the hospital. You imagine the faces of the people who might be dying above you. And you sit still because there's nothing else to be done. An elderly man beside me muttered a prayer. A child whimpered. Somewhere down the corridor, a baby began to cry in short, gasping sobs. Her mother rocked her gently, but the sound went on. Then came the sound I dread most, the whine. That sharp falling note just before impact. It cuts through everything. I flinched before I could stop myself, and the wall across from us shook. That one was very close. People began to cry openly. No shame in it now. A few huddled together. A warden moved among us with a torch, offering brief words of reassurance, his voice tight with strain. I don't know how long it lasted. Minutes stretch in a shelter. Time loses its shape. But eventually the blast stopped. The rumble faded. A brittle silence settled, interrupted only by coughs and sniffles. The all clear came just before sunset. We emerged like moles, blinking against the grey light. The street looked different. A haze hung in the air. I smelled smoke, plaster, and that strange chemical scent again. 1 block over, the chemists had taken a direct hit. Nothing left but broken walls and twisted metal. A fire engine stood nearby, its crew soaking smouldering beams with long jets of water. I could hear shouting, distant and urgent. 2 doors down from the post office, the little tailor's shop had been reduced to rubble. I stared at the spot, struggling to remember the owner's name. I'd taken a coat there once, years ago. He'd had a gentle voice and a proud moustache. I hoped he hadn't been inside. I didn't go home straight away. I walked, almost without thinking, through alleys and streets that used to be familiar, past windows boarded up with scrap wood, past craters still steaming at the edges. I saw a child's pram, overturned and empty, and a bicycle bent in half against a lamppost. Eventually, I turned onto a road I hadn't taken in months. My old school sat at the far end, surprisingly untouched. The gate creaked as I stepped through. The playground was empty, its hopscotch faded and half covered in dust. I sat on a bench and closed my eyes. For a few moments, I let myself drift. I imagined the shriek of girls skipping rope, the clang of the dinner bell, the sound of chalk against blackboard. I could almost see the ghost of my younger self, arms folded, scowling at arithmetic. It was a comfort, strangely, proof that life had been normal once. Back at the flat, I found my windows intact, though several slates from the roof had fallen into the street. I lit the stove and warmed a tin of soup. My hands trembled as I stirred, but I didn't spill a drop. Small victories. I ate slowly, every bite an effort. My ears still rang faintly from the blasts. I knew I wouldn't sleep well, but I tidied anyway, folded clothes, swept the floor, stacked tins. Control what you can, I reminded myself. Later, I wrote another letter to my sister. I didn't mention the raid. Instead, I told her about the woman on the radio who sang a lullaby in French, about the cat I saw curled up in a broken window frame, about the daffodils beginning to peek through the cracks by the station. Little things, lovely things. She's only 13. She doesn't need to carry all of this. One day she'll be old enough to ask, and I'll tell her then. But not now. Let her dream of safer skies. Before bed, I stood by the window a long time. The stars were out, dim behind the haze, but visible. I thought of the soldier's letter, the one about stars in the desert. I wondered if he was looking at them too. We're all just trying to survive the night. In our shelters, in our homes, in the broken spaces we still dare to call familiar. Tomorrow I'll walk past the rubble again. I'll go to work if the post office still stands. I'll sort letters and smile at strangers. And I'll do it all knowing that survival isn't just about escaping bombs. It's about holding on to something human in the midst of ruin. And so I will. I woke today before the light had changed, the dull greyness of dawn just starting to push against the blackout curtains. It's become a habit now, waking early, not by choice, but by the body's own rhythm, shaped by months of fear and vigilance. I didn't move at first, just lay there, listening to the silence. It wasn't peaceful, not really. It was the kind of silence that feels taut, like the pause between lightning and thunder. I eventually rose and boiled water, warming my hands on the kettle. The flat was cold, colder than usual. No fires lit overnight to conserve fuel, and the chill seems to cling to every surface. I dressed slowly, layer by layer, listening as the street began to stir. No sirens, no engines, just the scrape of bins being moved, a distant cough, the occasional rattle of a shop shutter being lifted. It felt, in a way, like normal life. I clung to that. Work was quieter than usual. Mr. Davison didn't say much. He rarely does now. And I busied myself with small tasks, replacing forms, rearranging drawers, checking stamps. People trickled in throughout the day. An old woman came in asking about a parcel she hadn't received. She seemed less concerned about the parcel than she did about being seen, about having someone acknowledge her. I made us both tea and listened while she spoke of her son in the Navy, and her garden that used to have roses, and the dog she lost to shrapnel. I said little, but I think that was enough. Later, a man dropped a letter addressed only to "My dearest," somewhere in London. I asked if he had a more specific address, but he only shook his head and smiled, as if to say that life is uncertain, but love, somehow, finds its way. I took the letter anyway, put it in the tray. Maybe it would reach her, maybe not. On the walk home, I noticed things I hadn't before. A child's drawing taped to a lamppost, a smiling sun above crooked houses, a shopkeeper whistling as he swept glass from his doorway, a boy walking two dogs, one clearly his and the other clearly adopted, their leashes knotted together like lifelines. These moments aren't loud, but they stand out. They remind you that even in war, life insists on continuing. I passed a building I hadn't seen since the last raid. It had taken a hit, the roof caved in, one wall gone entirely, but someone had planted flowers in the exposed fireplace. Daffodils, bright against the soot. They must have carried the soil in by hand, watered it with rationed water. I stood there for a long time, staring. A few others passed me and did the same. No one spoke. At home, I lit a candle and sat near the window, not opening the curtain, but just sitting close enough to feel connected to the outside. I thought about the woman on the corner again, the one I saw days ago, just standing. I hadn't seen her since. Maybe she'd been waiting for someone who never arrived. Maybe she was just trying to remember what it felt like to be still. Dinner was simple: bread, cheese, a few slices of pickled beetroot. I ate slowly, trying to savour the texture, the faint salt. It's funny how food becomes more than food during war. It becomes memory, comfort, hope, something to mark the time. Before bed, I read a few pages from a book I'd nearly forgotten I owned. The spine was cracked, the pages yellowed, but the words still held magic. A story of a journey, of someone trying to find their way home. I found myself reading aloud, softly, the sound filling the quiet room. Not for anyone else, just to remind myself that I had a voice, and that stories still mattered. As I lay down, I thought again about how strange it is to live like this. To count every day as a victory, even the ones where nothing happens. Especially those days. Because survival, in these times, isn't just about enduring the fire. It's about enduring the weight. It's about keeping a part of yourself untouched by all this. A small, stubborn flame that says, "I'm still here." Outside, the wind picked up. I could hear it whistle through the gaps in the windows, stirring the curtains just slightly. I closed my eyes and listened, waiting for the sirens, waiting for the hum of something terrible. But it didn't come. Not tonight. And for that, I was grateful. The war hasn't ended, but something in me feels like it's turned a corner. I can't explain it precisely. The bombings still come, the sirens still rise, the shelters still fill with the same heavy silence. But today, there was a moment, brief and almost invisible, when I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living again. It started this morning with a letter. Real, handwritten, stamped, and everything. From my sister. She said the school in Dorset had started planting a garden, and she was... I took the letter with me to the post office and read it 3 times between customers. Every line felt like sunlight. There were no dramatic stories, just small details. The colour of the flowers, the taste of the biscuits, the sound of the rain on the roof. But those small things were everything. They reminded me that the world was still turning somewhere beyond the rubble. And it made me want to find more of those details here, in London, even among the broken buildings and the blackened stone. At midday, I stepped out for a walk. The air had that damp scent of coming rain, and the clouds above moved lazily, unconcerned with our worry. I passed streets I knew, streets that had changed. The church near the river had lost its bell tower, but someone had propped the bell itself up on crates and painted a sign. Still rings. I tapped it with my knuckle and the sound rang out. Thin, clear, determined. I passed a boy drawing chalk figures on the pavement. He looked up and smiled as I walked by. "They're dancing," he said, "because the bombs missed today." I smiled back and kept going, heart swelling strangely at the sight. I used to draw in chalk too, long ago. Hopscotch grids, crooked cats, endless stars. I'd forgotten how good it felt to make something out of nothing. Later, I visited Mrs. Ahmed. She was baking flatbread, and the smell pulled me in before I'd even knocked. She had little to spare, but she offered a piece with tea, and we sat by her kitchen window, watching the street together. She told me about her childhood in Karachi, about hot nights and mango trees, about how the sky looked when the monsoon came. I listened, grateful, sipping warm tea from a chipped cup as if it were a feast. By the time I returned home, the light was beginning to fade. I lit a candle, not out of necessity this time, but because I wanted the glow. I made soup, listened to the wireless, and even hummed along with one of the songs. The kind of simple evening I used to take for granted. But the truth is, the war still hangs over everything. There's a part of me that flinches at every sudden noise, every car backfire, every creak in the pipes. I still check the sky when I go outside, still keep my bag packed by the door. I don't think that will ever leave me. Yet something has shifted. I'm remembering how to notice joy. Not just happiness, that's too large, too fleeting, but the quiet, enduring kind. The type that fits in a warm meal, a kind word, a laugh shared under a broken roof. Tonight, I stood by the window longer than usual. The sky was clear, stars blinking through the dark. I thought of everyone I've lost, and everyone I still have. I whispered their names, one by one, not as a ritual but as a remembrance. Names are powerful. They tether us to meaning. Before bed, I wrote again. Not just the usual log of events, but something fuller. A memory from childhood, a story my father once told, a dream I had last week of a house with windows that opened onto a vast green field. I don't know why I wrote it. Maybe to prove to myself that I still could. I'll keep going. That's what we do. We keep shops open and shelters swept. We share food and music and news. We notice daffodils and dancing chalkmen. We write letters. We wait. We hope. And one day, the silence will mean peace, not fear. Until then, I will wake. I will dress. I will walk through the city and see not just its wounds, but its will. I will see people, not ghosts. I will speak softly. I will be kind. And I will live. Reflections. As the final bombs fell and the skies began to clear over London, a strange silence took hold. Not the kind that comes with peace, but a quieter, heavier silence. One of exhaustion, of reckoning, of trying to understand what had just passed. The Blitz had ended, at least officially, in May 1941, though sporadic raids continued for some time after. For 8 long months, the people of London and other major cities across the UK had lived under nightly assault. Now, the absence of sirens and the hush in the skies was almost unsettling. The city itself bore the marks of the battle it had endured. Entire streets were flattened, churches, homes, schools gone. Gaping holes punctuated neighbourhoods where once row houses stood in tidy rows. Rubble spilled out over cobblestones, twisted girders poked into the sky like skeletal fingers. And yet, despite it all, life resumed. People climbed out of shelters and basements, blinking against the morning sun, and went back to work. Children returned to what schools remained, sometimes taking classes in half-bombed rooms with no roofs. The sense of community that had emerged during the Blitz lingered like the smell of smoke that clung to London's air. Neighbours had become closer. Strangers had become allies. The shared experience of fear, loss, and resistance had bound people together in ways that would never quite be undone. But alongside that camaraderie was grief. The loss was staggering. Over 40,000 civilians killed, tens of thousands more injured, hundreds of thousands displaced. In cities like Coventry, Plymouth, and Liverpool, the scars were just as deep. In the weeks following the official end of the Blitz, the British government shifted its messaging from survival to reconstruction. Pamphlets were circulated urging citizens to be patient, to keep morale high, and to begin preparing for a better future. Plans were drawn for rebuilding homes, restoring industries, and fortifying the spirit of the nation. But rebuilding, it turned out, wasn't just about bricks and mortar, it was about hearts, minds, and memory. For many, the first step was confronting what they had endured. People began talking, slowly, carefully, about the nights spent in fear, about the friends and family lost, about the strange quiet that followed each raid. Psychologists and social workers noted an uptick in cases of insomnia, nervous exhaustion, and what we'd now recognise as PTSD. But at the time, such terms didn't exist. There was only nerves, war strain, or bomb shock. There was no national therapy program, no counselling hotline. Instead, people leaned on each other, on ritual, on routine. Churches, surprisingly, saw a surge in attendance, not always out of faith, but out of a need for structure, familiarity, and a place to express collective grief. Funerals became communal acts of remembrance. Services for those lost in major raids were often attended by entire boroughs. Memorial walls were erected. Names were read aloud. Silence fell, not in terror this time, but in mourning. The cultural response to the Blitz also began to take shape. Poets and playwrights grappled with what had happened. Newspapers ran essays that tried to make sense of it all, some patriotic, others deeply personal. The BBC aired reflective pieces, some spoken in soft, sombre tones during late-night hours. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the pause in the bombing allowed people to step back and begin the difficult task of processing what they had lived through. And for many women, the end of the Blitz brought a shift in roles. During the height of the bombing, women had taken on a wide array of responsibilities, working in factories, driving ambulances, serving in civil defence roles, even manning anti-aircraft guns in some cases. With the return to a slightly more stable routine, questions arose about whether they would or should return to traditional domestic roles. The war had cracked open ideas about gender, class, and power in ways that couldn't be neatly put back in the box. There was also an undercurrent of guilt. Those who survived, especially those whose homes and families had been spared, often found themselves grappling with a quiet, gnawing question: why not me? This survivor's guilt wasn't named as such, but it threaded through conversations and letters, visible between the lines. People found themselves trying to carry on, while feeling as though they were doing so on behalf of those who couldn't. And yet, despite all of this, despite the devastation, the grief, the confusion, there was pride. A sense, however battered, that Britain had stood firm, that London had not fallen, that the enemy had not broken the spirit of its people. The slogan, "London can take it," was more than wartime propaganda. It had become a mantra, a badge of honour, a way to make sense of the senseless. The first part of what happened after the Blitz, then, wasn't a neat chapter of healing or renewal. It was messy, uncertain, and filled with contradiction. People smiled with relief while carrying unimaginable sadness. They rebuilt while still ducking at sudden noises. They told stories while trying to forget. But one thing was clear: they had survived. And survival, in a time like that, was a kind of victory all its own. As the summer of 1941 settled over Britain, the damage from the Blitz was no longer just a matter of collapsed buildings or craters in the streets. It was embedded in the daily rhythms of life. Families still cooked meals in temporary kitchens, children played among the ruins, and many people remained in makeshift accommodation. Churches, schools, and even tube stations that had once served as shelters were now long-term homes for the displaced. Every walk through a neighbourhood brought reminders of who had been there and who had not made it through. The government launched large-scale surveys to assess the extent of the damage, not only structurally but socially. Across the country, civil servants compiled reports on housing shortages, food insecurity, and morale. One of the most pressing challenges was rehousing the hundreds of thousands who had lost their homes. Emergency prefabricated houses, prefabs, were proposed as a solution, and soon construction teams worked around the clock to erect these simple, functional homes. To many, they felt like a fresh start, a small, simple promise of stability after chaos. Education became a renewed focus too. Many schools had been bombed or requisitioned during the Blitz, and whole generations of children had seen their schooling interrupted. Makeshift classrooms sprang up in church halls and community centres. Teachers, often traumatised themselves, returned to work determined to restore some sense of normalcy. For children, the war was becoming less about adventure and more about absence. Absent fathers, absent homes, and now absent years of education. The effects of this disruption rippled outward for years, shaping both childhood and national policy. One quiet revolution unfolded in the kitchens and allotments of Britain. The Blitz had intensified the strain on food supplies, and rationing had forced people to become extraordinarily resourceful. But it also spurred creativity. Cookbooks were written specifically for rationed goods. Community cookery classes taught people how to make nourishing meals out of scraps. Urban gardening efforts, dubbed Dig for Victory, transformed bomb sites and empty lots into vegetable patches. People took immense pride in coaxing life from the soil, as if reclaiming their city one seed at a time. Yet the social fractures caused by the Blitz could not be masked by community gardens or cheerful posters. The rich and the poor had not endured the bombing equally. While some upper-class families retreated to country homes, the working class bore the brunt of nightly raids. In cities like London and Birmingham, whole districts of workers' housing had been wiped out. The disparity prompted political questions. Who had protected whom? Who had suffered most? And what would a fairer post-war Britain look like if everyone, regardless of class or postcode, had a voice? Churchill's government, keenly aware of these tensions, commissioned several studies to examine the public mood and expectations for post-war life. What emerged was clear. The British people wanted change. They wanted not just to survive the war, but to come out of it into a better country. The Beveridge Report, released in 1942, would eventually give voice to these aspirations, calling for the defeat of the 5 giants of want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. The Blitz had, inadvertently, laid the groundwork for a reimagined society, one more conscious of justice and care. Another shift unfolded in the arts and culture of the time. Artists, many of whom had spent the Blitz documenting destruction, began to turn their focus toward resilience. Painters captured scenes of community rebuilding. Playwrights and authors wrote stories that explored themes of endurance and rebirth. The ruins themselves became symbols, not just of loss, but of possibility. The idea that something better might grow from destruction became a recurring motif. In galleries and bookshops, the nation saw echoes of its own survival, rendered in paint and prose. For some, however, the end of the Blitz brought a deep sense of isolation. During the raids, the routines of collective sheltering and the shared fear had created a kind of enforced intimacy. Now that people were returning to homes, however damaged, those routines vanished. Loneliness set in. The elderly, in particular, were vulnerable to this shift. Many had lost not only homes but families, and the sudden return to silence was painful. Voluntary organizations attempted to fill the gap, creating visiting services for the lonely and traumatized. The psychological aftermath also began to surface more visibly. Nightmares were common. Children played air raid and evacuation games in the rubble, their laughter tinged with memories of fear. Some adults withdrew from social life entirely, struggling with unspoken trauma. Others found themselves unable to sleep in a proper bed, preferring the familiarity of shelters and cellars. The trauma was communal but deeply individual. The vocabulary to talk about it barely existed, so people fell back on the familiar comforts of routine and silence. There was also the matter of justice. As accounts of the bombing were compiled and studied, many asked whether the Luftwaffe's deliberate targeting of civilians constituted a war crime. Though such language was not commonly used in public discourse, the sentiment existed. The horror of Coventry, the terror in London's East End, the flattening of entire neighbourhoods, these acts left a bitter residue. The public appetite for accountability began to grow, though for now it simmered beneath the surface of grief and survival. One of the most poignant legacies of the Blitz was found in the way people commemorated those they lost. Makeshift shrines turned into permanent memorials. Plaques appeared on walls, benches, and lampposts. Annual services were held on the anniversaries of major raids. These weren't just about remembering the dead. They were about giving shape to a period that often felt shapeless, about saying, "This happened, and we were here." The class system, while still rigid, had shifted slightly under the weight of collective suffering. Shared shelters and shared trauma had temporarily collapsed social barriers. Working-class men and women found themselves collaborating with those they would never have spoken to before the war. Some of those changes endured, forming the basis for new social movements that would gain strength in the post-war years. Others faded as people returned to old hierarchies, but the memory of a more equal struggle remained, echoing in the push for a fairer future. For Britain's cities, the end of the Blitz marked the beginning of one of the largest urban planning efforts in the country's history. Visionaries began drawing up plans for what post-war Britain could look like, not merely a restored version of the old, but something new. This included better housing, green spaces, and more thoughtful infrastructure. These ideas would eventually find expression in the post-war Labour government's reconstruction efforts, but their seeds were sown here, in the ashes of bombed-out buildings and broken systems. Part 2 of this reflection on the Blitz's aftermath is not simply about repair. It's about what rose in the space created by ruin. A sense of responsibility, a determination to make good on the sacrifices made, and a quiet resolve that the suffering of the past year should not be for nothing. Britain had survived the Blitz not only because of its defences, but because of its people. And now, those same people were beginning to ask, what kind of country should we build from the rubble? By the autumn of 1941, the rhythms of life in post-Blitz Britain had begun to harden into something like normality, though that word had lost much of its meaning. There was no returning to the way things had been. People spoke often of before the war and during the Blitz, as if they were completely separate worlds, and in many ways they were. The scars on the land mirrored the fractures in people's sense of time and identity. The idea of recovery no longer felt like a finish line, but rather an ongoing journey toward emotional and physical recovery. One striking transformation during this period was the reinvention of public spaces. Where parks and gardens had once been green havens for leisure, they had become functional extensions of the war effort, converted into allotments, military assembly points, or even mass graves in the bleakest periods of the Blitz. Now, communities began reclaiming them. Volunteers swept up broken glass, replanted trees, and repainted benches. There was something quietly defiant about it, a signal that beauty and life would one day flourish again, even in the shadow of ruins. In bombed-out neighborhoods, a unique kind of landscape emerged. Children, ever adaptable, treated the ruins as playgrounds, dangerous and thrilling. They darted through collapsed walls and skipped across beams, turning destruction into make-believe adventure. For parents, the ruins were less romantic. They were daily reminders of loss and hardship, but they were also canvases of possibility. Community centres began hosting rebuilding clubs, where residents could learn basic masonry, carpentry, and plan the futures of the neighbourhoods they refused to abandon. The emotional toll of the Blitz remained a stubborn undercurrent. While some people spoke openly of their experiences, others kept their memories locked away. British stoicism was both shield and shackle. To cry was still considered weak by many, to complain was unpatriotic. Yet the strain showed. Marriages faltered, tempers shortened. Men returning from military assignments or civil defence duties found it hard to reconnect with their families. The chaos that had bound them during the raids was gone, and what replaced it was harder to define, an unease in the stillness. Churchill, ever the symbol of British resolve, continued to speak of perseverance and destiny. His speeches still stirred pride, but they also carried a weight of expectation. The people had stood firm during the Blitz. Now they were expected to carry that same fortitude through years more of war. For some, this call to endurance was inspirational. For others, it felt like a burden too heavy to keep shouldering. Industries adapted to the new phase of the war. Many of the factories that had ramped up during the Blitz to produce munitions and supplies now shifted to long-term wartime production. Women remained at the forefront of this effort, their skills honed and their confidence grown. They welded, riveted, assembled, and inspected with efficiency that rivaled their male counterparts. Though not always welcomed or recognized equally, their contributions were no longer seen as temporary. They were indispensable. And with that came another slow-burning realization. The social contract had changed. During the Blitz, the nation had promised that sacrifice would lead to a better tomorrow. Now, people were beginning to demand it. Debates sparked in town halls and pubs about the future of healthcare, of housing, of education. People wrote letters to their MPs, to the BBC, to newspapers, asking pointed questions. Would the slums be cleared? Would there be jobs for all? Would children get proper schooling? The Blitz had demanded so much that people now demanded something in return. Progress. Meanwhile, the cultural pulse of the country beat in new rhythms. Films and plays reflecting wartime experience found eager audiences. Some depicted heroic resistance, others quieter domestic struggles. Books about grief, loss, and courage found their way onto shelves beside instructional pamphlets on salvage and rationing. Even the visual language of the Blitz, sandbags, blackout curtains, and sirens began to appear as motifs in post-Blitz art, emblematic of resilience, but also of fatigue. And not everyone responded to the end of the Blitz with relief. Some people missed the strange camaraderie of those months. They missed the unity, the clarity of purpose, the feeling that everyone was pulling in the same direction. In its absence, daily life felt fragmented. A strange nostalgia took hold, one that didn't deny the horror, but longed for the unity it had forged. This was particularly strong among younger people, who had come of age in the firelight of air raids and found peacetime oddly disorienting, as if the quiet itself were somehow unnatural. In the countryside, evacuees had begun returning to the cities. Not all of them went willingly. Many children had grown attached to their host families, rural rhythms, and open skies. The return to bomb-scarred cities was jarring. Families struggled to reconnect after years apart. Some children came back changed, quieter, more independent, or resentful. Others had forgotten city life entirely. The emotional reunions were sometimes joyous, sometimes strained. And amid this, social workers and teachers tried to rebuild trust and structure one careful lesson at a time. Perhaps the most poignant moments of this period came at dusk. As the days grew shorter and autumn settled in, people noticed the absence of sirens. The quiet that had once felt ominous now brought a different kind of unease, an awareness of all that had been lost. People lit candles for the dead. Some sat in silence at the times when raids used to begin. It was not ritual exactly, but it was remembrance. And in that remembrance, a form of healing. Municipal authorities continued the difficult work of city planning under wartime constraints. Budgets were thin, materials scarce, and every improvement came with a price. But they pressed on, erecting temporary housing, reinforcing weakened structures, and even installing public murals to lift spirits. It was a strange era of impermanence. Nothing was quite finished, yet everything was moving forward. By the close of 1941, Britain stood in a paradoxical space. It was both broken and determined, grieving and hopeful. The Blitz had not defeated the spirit of its people, but it had changed them in profound, permanent ways. They were harder now, quieter, more introspective. And beneath the surface of daily life, they were asking questions about who they were, what they had endured, and what kind of nation might emerge from the rubble. Part 3 of this journey through the Blitz's aftermath reminds us that survival is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new one. A story of memory, of reconstruction, and of reshaping a country's soul one brick, one breath, one night of sleep at a time. As winter descended on Britain in 1941, the realities of a country scarred by aerial warfare became starker. The nights were long again, but now they passed without sirens. People could sleep, but sleep often brought dreams of fire, collapse, and buried cries. The physical trauma of the Blitz had ended, but its shadow lingered in minds and routines. A certain hypervigilance remained. People still looked to the skies with suspicion, still flinched at the sudden clatter of a dropped object or a rumbling lorry or thunderclap that sounded too much like the past. One of the challenges of the post-Blitz months was confronting absence. In every community, familiar faces had vanished. A man who once swept the street, a child who used to laugh on the stoop, a mother who volunteered in the canteen. These absences were never quite filled. Their names were spoken in lower tones. Their belongings lingered in homes, too precious to discard, but too painful to touch. Survivors carried these ghosts with them, invisible companions in bread queues and bus stops. They shaped the atmosphere in subtle ways, always present in the back of people's minds. Public initiatives began to address this grief, though cautiously. Memorial gardens were proposed in heavily bombed boroughs. Plaques were placed on destroyed sites. But the efforts often felt too small for the scale of the loss. A garden could not restore a row of vanished homes. A plaque could not speak for hundreds buried beneath rubble. Still, people came. They laid flowers. They stood in silence. In those moments, memory became a form of resistance, not against an enemy, but against the erasure of experience, and the lives lived through it. In the corridors of government, the end of the Blitz had prompted more than mourning. It had opened the door to planning. Ministers argued over the future shape of the nation. Debates grew louder about post-war housing, employment, and welfare. The destruction had laid bare deep inequalities. Entire working-class communities had been decimated, while the affluent often relocated to safety. The social fabric had not merely been stressed, it had been torn. Now came the question, should it be stitched back as it had been? Or should it be rebuilt for the better, from the foundations up? The Ministry of Health, seeing both opportunity and obligation, commissioned studies into urban renewal. The concept of zoned cities began to gain traction, separating industry from residential life, introducing green spaces, and improving transport links. Though wartime constraints limited immediate action, the blueprints offered a vision of a more humane city. Civil servants, planners, and architects worked late into the night by candlelight, dreaming of neighbourhoods that would lift people up rather than simply contain them. Civilians, too, began to imagine differently. Letters to newspapers expressed hope for a Britain that would care for all its citizens, not just the lucky or wealthy. "We did not endure the Blitz," one letter read, "just to return to slums and soup kitchens." There was a quiet radicalism in these words, born not of ideology but experience. Shared suffering had become shared purpose. In neighbourhood halls, people gathered to discuss more than repairs. They talked of justice, of rights, of the lives they wanted, a society built on dignity and fairness, not just survival. The role of women, so profoundly expanded during the Blitz, entered a new chapter. With the bombing slowed and men still away at war, women found themselves managing households, working full-time, and organising relief efforts. Many no longer saw themselves as temporary placeholders. They had proven their strength. Their work had kept cities alive, yet some institutions were eager to push them back into the background. Tensions simmered. A cultural shift was underway. In more subtle ways, the Blitz had changed how people related to time itself. There was less patience for frivolity, less tolerance for delay. Life had shown its fragility. People wanted to live deliberately. Some married quickly, others changed careers. Many who had once kept to themselves now sought community. "If a bomb could fall tomorrow," a man said in a BBC interview, "why wait to do what matters today?" The past year had redefined priorities. The arts, still deeply entwined with national morale, continued to evolve. Painters turned their eyes from the chaos of falling bombs to the quiet endurance of survivors. Playwrights staged dramas set in cramped kitchens and crumbling tenements. Poets wrote elegies for lost streets and lullabies for children born in bunkers. Even music changed. Songs of resistance gave way to ballads of memory and yearning. The cultural narrative was shifting from defiance to reflection. In schools, teachers faced the daunting task of nurturing children who had grown up amid sirens and rubble. Some students showed resilience beyond their years. Others were withdrawn, quick to anger or tears. Curriculum slowly reintroduced literature, history, and the arts, subjects once put aside for wartime basics. Storytelling, in particular, became a vital tool. Children were encouraged to write about their experiences, to draw what they remembered. Educators recognized that expression was healing. The classroom became not just a place of learning, but of quiet recovery. Meanwhile, infrastructure slowly crept back. Gas lines were repaired, roads were cleared, trains resumed more regular service, but much remained patchwork. Delays were common, materials were scarce. Volunteers filled gaps where councils couldn't. People lent tools, shared meals, offered labour. The communal spirit that had bloomed in bomb shelters now lived in scaffolding and soup pots. Britain was rebuilding itself, not just through policy, but through neighbourly hands. In London's East End, one of the hardest hit areas, a kind of stubborn pride emerged. Residents joked that they were now made of bricks and soot. Children scrawled chalk drawings on walls that no longer stood. Women swapped blackout curtains for patchwork ones. Markets reopened amid ruins. Life, in all its ordinariness, pressed forward. And this ordinariness was heroic. It was not about medals or speeches. It was about buying milk, finding shoes, planting potatoes, doing what needed to be done. As the fourth season post-Blitz drew to a close, there remained a tension between forward motion and solemn remembrance. Some wanted to forget, to clear the ruins and move on. Others feared that forgetting would dishonour the dead. This tension surfaced in local councils and living rooms alike. In time, it would shape how Britain chose to commemorate the Blitz, with balance, with quiet dignity, with spaces not just of loss, but of legacy. Part 4 of this story reveals that what came after the bombs was not merely cleanup, it was rebirth, but not in grand gestures, in small human acts of courage, in meals cooked, walls painted, and songs sung. In the decision to live not just in defiance of what had happened, but in devotion to what could still be built. As spring 1942 crept into view, the chill of the past year began to lift, not only from the weather, but from the national psyche. The season brought with it subtle signs of restoration. Crocuses sprouted between cracks in the pavement. Children chalked hopscotch grids on half-demolished streets. Shop fronts were boarded up less often. Londoners and others across Britain had come through a kind of fire, and the soot was finally beginning to settle. But the journey toward healing was complex. It was not a return to peace, but a shift into a different kind of endurance. One of the most powerful forces shaping this new season was memory. The Blitz had seared itself into the collective consciousness. Communities were no longer merely places of residence. They were repositories of stories. Old men at the pub swapped tales of near misses and unlikely survival. Women recounted the hours they'd spent shielding children under staircases. Teenagers spoke with surprising authority about structural damage and escape routes. Even the youngest children, those born during the Blitz, carried it in their blood, a strange inheritance of sirens and silence. Historians and journalists began to collect these stories, recognizing their historical and emotional value. Oral history projects emerged, capturing the voices of ordinary citizens who had become, unwittingly, witnesses to history. These interviews revealed a spectrum of experience. The stoicism, yes, but also the panic, the anger, the helplessness. It was not one uniform narrative, but a constellation of overlapping truths. Some found healing in the telling. Others found it too painful, preferring silence to the risk of unravelling emotionally. In Parliament, policymakers faced increasing pressure to match the sacrifices of wartime with promises for peace. More and more citizens voiced the belief that the nation owed them something, not as charity but as justice. The Blitz had forged a social compact. If people could endure so much, then surely the government could ensure a better life afterwards. This undercurrent began to influence politics in quiet but potent ways. Members of Parliament who ignored these sentiments risked losing public favour. Those who embraced reform gained popular support. Churches continued to serve as sanctuaries, not only of faith but of memory. Special services were held to mark the anniversaries of particularly brutal raids. Entire congregations wept together. In bombed-out parishes, priests delivered sermons among rubble, sometimes using makeshift pulpits and salvaged hymnals. Faith had not spared them from the horrors, but it now offered structure to the mourning. And with that structure came a kind of solace, however imperfect. Schools played their part too. Teachers worked not only to educate but to stabilize. They used storytelling, music, and shared routines to build resilience. Pupils who once hid under desks during raids now recited poetry in classrooms with broken windows. The contrast was sharp, and for many children, confusing. They had grown up with the threat of death as background noise. Now they were asked to sit still and copy sums. But slowly, routine reasserted itself. Familiarity bred calm. The rebuilding of infrastructure took on a new pace in the spring. With longer daylight and slightly eased material shortages, work crews redoubled their efforts. Roads were repaved, utility poles reinstalled, and street lamps reconnected. Each flickering bulb brought a kind of symbolic victory. Light had returned. In many neighborhoods, murals began to appear. Some government-commissioned, others created by local artists. They depicted not only the tragedy of the Blitz, but the strength of those who endured and helped rebuild their communities. The arts became a mirror and a balm. Radio dramas revisited the war experience, carefully walking the line between tribute and trauma. New novels emerged, written in cramped bedsits by authors who had lived through the worst of it. Theatre companies staged productions in converted warehouses and community halls, often incorporating survivor testimony or documentary fragments. People attended these performances not just for entertainment, but for catharsis. The act of bearing witness had become communal. For many women, the post-Blitz period marked a reckoning. They had kept homes intact, fed families from ration books, and braved nightly terror with unwavering resolve. Now, as the immediate threat receded, society began nudging them back into the shadows. Some resisted. Women's groups held meetings demanding equal recognition and opportunity. Articles in magazines and newspapers questioned the inevitability of returning to pre-war gender roles. A movement was forming, not yet fully conscious of itself, but already quietly asserting its presence in every part of society. In the factories and workshops that had stayed open through the Blitz, new recruits arrived daily. Young people, inspired by the fortitude of their elders, took up jobs that once terrified them. Apprentices learned from bomb-scarred veterans. Wages were meagre, but pride ran high. Production wasn't just about supporting the war. It was about proving that destruction had not broken the nation's back. There was grit in every machine hum and every hammer's strike. Still, beneath the surface, trauma remained. Medical professionals, few as they were, started to document recurring patterns: insomnia, stuttering, sudden aggression, emotional detachment. There were no formal diagnoses for what we now call PTSD, but its symptoms haunted many. People coped as best they could, with alcohol, stoic silence, or quiet walks through the ruins. Families learned to tiptoe around certain topics. What had once been shouted over the drone of bombers was now buried beneath smiles and the unspoken need to move forward. One unexpected consequence of the Blitz was a new intimacy with death. Funerals became deeply personal affairs, even when held en masse. Graveyards were full, but still people came, bringing fresh flowers, singing hymns they remembered from childhood, sometimes weeping, sometimes standing dry-eyed, but no less shattered. Death had visited every street, and in doing so, it had stripped away pretense. People were kinder in some ways, slower to judge, quicker to forgive. They had all been touched by loss. As the fifth reflection draws to a close, it becomes clear that what followed the Blitz was not a single story, but a mosaic. 1,000 little resurrections, some loud, some barely visible. It was the sweeping of a floor in a bombed-out bakery, the knitting of a blanket for a neighbour who'd lost everything, the laughter of a child who had forgotten, just for a moment, the world's cruelty. Britain was no longer what it had been, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was becoming something stronger, stitched together not just from materials, but from memories and willpower. By the summer of 1942, the mood across Britain had shifted again, still shadowed by war, yet more certain in its direction. The Blitz was becoming a memory, but not a distant one. Its remnants were everywhere, in the cratered lots now sprouting weeds, in the smoke-scorched facades of old buildings, in the nightly rituals of checking the blackout curtains, even though the worst had passed. There was a new kind of rhythm now, a pulse of cautious optimism mixed with a deep weariness. People spoke of the Blitz less often in hushed tones of horror, and more frequently in practical terms. What had been lost? What could be salvaged? What could be rebuilt better? And what must never happen again? These questions guided conversations in homes, schools, churches, and council offices. The mood was not celebratory, but it was determined. The nation had faced its trial and had not broken. Now it would rebuild, not just the physical world, but its moral and social foundations. A growing number of citizens turned to activism, shaped by what they had endured. The shared trauma of nightly bombing raids had made people more conscious of one another. Poverty, illness, and slum housing were no longer abstract concerns. They were enemies as real as any invading army. If people could come together to survive a bombing campaign, surely they could unite to demand better schools, fairer wages, and decent homes. These thoughts gave rise to grassroots movements, trade union demands, and local campaigns that would later shape the foundations of the welfare state. Among the many changes, local councils began taking bold steps in post-Blitz planning. Some proposed entirely new layouts for damaged districts, drawing up neighbourhood plans with improved sanitation, ventilation, and green spaces. Architects spoke not only of form and structure, but of dignity. Housing, they argued, should no longer be crowded, damp, or dangerous. It should uplift those within it. Though resources remained limited and implementation slow, the seeds of modern urban policy had taken root and would shape policy for decades to come. Meanwhile, newspapers filled their pages with stories of survival and invention. Reports from across the country showed how communities had turned adversity into progress. A bombed-out theatre reopened as a community centre. A destroyed warehouse became a youth club. A ruined church now held weekly music lessons. The stories weren't triumphalist. They didn't ignore the pain, but they offered something rare in wartime Britain: hope with evidence. This hope also manifested in the quieter, less tangible ways people supported one another. Young couples who had delayed weddings now married, sometimes in borrowed clothes and with second-hand rings. Babies born during or just after the Blitz were christened in rubble-cleared sanctuaries. Elderly neighbours found themselves more looked after than before, as younger families remembered their kindness during dark nights. The war continued, but something communal and caring had taken root amidst the wreckage. The arts remained vital in giving shape to this experience. Films emerged that examined the home front with unflinching honesty. These weren't propaganda pieces, but character-driven narratives that showed the complexity of grief, bravery, and endurance. Novels published in this period became national talking points. One, a fictional diary of a housewife during the Blitz, became a bestseller, its mix of mundane detail and emotional depth capturing something many had lived but struggled to articulate. Radio, too, remained a lifeline. Broadcasts included music, interviews, plays, and special readings from poetry and scripture. But increasingly, listeners heard everyday voices: shopkeepers, nurses, firefighters, schoolchildren. The BBC had realised that the public no longer wanted lofty voices speaking down to them. They wanted to hear each other. These broadcasts didn't just entertain. They connected, calmed, and affirmed a sense of shared experience. In public health, a quiet revolution was underway. the Blitz had revealed vulnerabilities in emergency services and civilian care. Makeshift hospitals and overstretched doctors had done their best, but the limitations had been clear. Now committees were forming, studying how health could be better delivered across the country. Some proposed a national system, free at the point of use. Radical at the time, the idea was fueled by the belief that no one who had endured the Blitz should ever go without treatment or dignity ever again. At the same time, education reform moved up the agenda. Children who had missed years of learning due to evacuations or bombings were struggling to catch up. And some were bright but illiterate. Others had become accustomed to chaos and found it hard to sit still or concentrate. Teachers, many of whom had experienced trauma themselves, adapted curricula to include not just reading and arithmetic, but emotional expression, resilience building, and history told from lived memory. The schoolroom became a place for recovery, growth, and hope beyond the rubble of the past. Meanwhile, families continued to grapple with altered dynamics. The Blitz had reshaped households. Some had taken in relatives who never left. Others had lost breadwinners and learned to make do on reduced means. Women, now accustomed to autonomy, found themselves resisting the quiet return of old hierarchies. Children, having witnessed both heroism and horror, matured quickly and often spoke with a seriousness beyond their years. The war had compressed childhood into something sharper, more watchful. In this new world, silence became a way of coping. Many who had lived through the worst chose not to revisit it in conversation. Instead, they channeled their energies into work, family, and quiet acts of preservation. A man repaired a neighbour's roof without being asked. A woman cooked double portions and left one on a doorstep. These were not acts of charity, but of community survival. They were ways of saying, "We are still here, and we remember." As the 6th chapter of this post-Blitz journey closes, one truth rises to the surface. The Blitz did not simply destroy, it revealed. It laid bare the fractures and strengths of a nation. It exposed the inequalities that had long festered, but also the endurance that had long gone unrecognized. In its wake, it left not just ruins, but questions, urgent, aching questions, about what kind of society would emerge from the ashes, and who would have a say in shaping it. As 1942 drew toward its end, the shadow of the Blitz began to retreat into the rear view of history. It had become something people referred to with a mixture of solemnity and disbelief. Those nights, they'd say, or during the worst of it. And though Britain was still very much at war, the phase marked by nightly air raids had become a chapter closed. Yet the work of reckoning had only just begun. The final phase of the Blitz's legacy was not the clearing of rubble or the laying of new brick, but the internalization of its meaning. For survivors, especially those in the cities most brutally targeted, the memory became a defining marker in the story of their lives. Conversations about the future always seemed to circle back to what had been endured. Rebuilding was physical, yes, but it was also philosophical. How to build a better society, how to honor the dead, and how to live in such a way that the suffering had meaning, that peace was purposeful. One of the most powerful, if understated, cultural shifts was in the understanding of class and the shared burden of survival. The bombs had not discriminated, and though some areas suffered more, no one was truly untouched. A banker and a baker might have shared a shelter. A factory worker and a university professor might have passed each other in the rubble, offering nods of shared endurance. That kind of intimacy, born of necessity, did not vanish overnight. It lingered in how people spoke to one another with a new sense of empathy and connection. The labour movement drew momentum from this. Trade unions gained strength, bolstered by the knowledge that many of their members had not only fought in the factories, but also died in their beds. political discourse began to shift leftward. The electorate, particularly in urban centres, became more vocal about the kind of country they wanted to see. The war had asked them to sacrifice. Now they asked for something in return: fairness, stability, security. This demand began to crystallise into policy. The Beveridge Report, released in late 1942, offered a blueprint for a welfare state, a bold, transformative vision that seemed to channel the hopes forged in the fire of the Blitz. It named the enemies: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. It proposed universal benefits, healthcare, and education reform. People read it not as an abstract government document, but as a promise that their suffering would not be in vain. In the homes of ordinary people, the legacy of the Blitz showed up in more personal ways. Parents told their children stories, not just of danger, but of courage. They described the neighbour who gave up his ration book to feed a hungry child, the nurse who worked through 5 consecutive raids, the fireman who never stopped pulling bodies from the rubble. These stories became family lore, passed down like heirlooms. They served not only as memory, but as moral compass. Architects and planners, too, moved from theory to action. Bomb sites became test beds for new ideas: better housing layouts, communal green spaces, multi-use buildings. Some of these ideas took decades to realise, but their seeds were planted here. The phrase "built from the Blitz" became more than metaphor. It referred to an entire generation of design that responded to devastation with dignity. At the same time, there was a quiet fear that the Blitz would be romanticised. Some newspapers began to speak of it with too much sentimentality, portraying the raids as some noble crucible in which the British character had been purified. Many who had lived through it pushed back. It had not been noble, they insisted. It had been terrifying. People hadn't sung in the shelters out of joy. They had done so to drown out the noise of collapsing ceilings. Survivors did not want medals. They wanted memory to be honoured with honesty, not myth. This tension, between memory and myth, shaped much of the national conversation in the years that followed. Commemorations were organised, but carefully. Memorial plaques were unveiled, but not always with fanfare. There was an unspoken understanding that grief, like courage, should not be performed too loudly. It should be carried with dignity. This became the tone of remembrance: reflective, resolute, respectful. In schools, the Blitz became a subject of study. Not only the dates and destruction, but the human stories. Teachers assigned essays on moral choices during the raids. Pupils interviewed their grandparents. Drama students reenacted moments from the shelters. It was not about glorification, it was about connection between past and present, between what had been endured and what must never be forgotten. And as peace eventually returned to Europe, there was another reckoning to come: the comparison of Britain's suffering with that of others. Newsreels began to show the full horror of the Holocaust, the flattening of Dresden, the ruins of Hiroshima. The Blitz, once the apex of British pain, was placed in a broader context. This did not diminish it, but it reframed it. The people of Britain began to see themselves as part of a global story of endurance and aftermath. In this light, the final legacy of the Blitz became not one of victimhood, but of stewardship. Those who survived bore a kind of responsibility to live wisely, to rebuild thoughtfully, to speak for those who couldn't. For many, it meant lives of quiet service, joining the council, volunteering at schools, running local charities. Others simply lived with more gratitude: a warm home, a safe bed, a quiet sky. These were not taken for granted anymore. And in the end, that may have been the most profound outcome of all: the deepened value placed on ordinary life, the peace of reading a book by lamplight, the joy of sharing tea with a neighbour, the sacredness of tucking a child into bed without fear. These simple acts, once mundane, were now cherished. They had survived the Blitz, and in doing so, they had become the quiet emblems of what it meant to live. So concludes the seventh and final part of this reflection. The Blitz ended with silence, but from that silence rose 1,000 voices. Of loss, of resilience, of hope. Britain did not emerge unscathed. It emerged changed, and from its broken streets and broken hearts, it built something new, not perfect, but principled. Something that said, we endured, we remembered, and we carried on,